It is a very great pleasure to be back in the hills. Thank you to Janvi and all your family for the introduction and for the welcome. It's really a delight to be at Abbotsford again. This is an extraordinary place, an extraordinary home, an extraordinary house, an extraordinary piece of, let's say, hill history. And it's really the perfect site, I think, for the Himalayan Echoes Festival. So we're going to try to cover quite a lot of ground in a relatively short time for this opening session. I think I first heard about Dr. Lobsang Sangay a little under 10 years ago, before he became the Sikyong of the Central Tibetan Administration, the President of the Central Tibetan Administration, the Tibetan Prime Minister in exile, as some people would put it, depending on what sort of audience they were speaking to. And I actually remember writing a blog in advance of his election, saying that he was, I thought, the best candidate. He was at that time, because of his Harvard Law School background, being described by some as the Tibetan Obama. And my feeling, having been involved with the Tibet issue and various campaigns around Tibet since my student days, since my first journey to Tibet in 1986, I felt that he was a new face, a new generation, and a new voice. And I think he's been highly successful in fulfilling what is a very, very difficult role. He was saying earlier that he spends 50% of time in India, 50% around the rest of the world. He's off to Delhi tomorrow, he's off to Prague the next day, and I think a few days later you'll be back in Simla. Can you maybe start by just describing a little of, let's say, a typical week in your life?
It all depends where I am, actually. Just a week ago, we had the Tibetan Parliament in session. So I think we had the most grueling session, because 45 members of Parliament can ask us any number of questions on any number of topic, and then we have to answer right then and there. And other weeks, actually, I will be in one settlement, Tibetan settlement. Some parts are very remote. And then a week later, I'm in Prague in one of the fancy hotels provided by the organizer. So the Buddhist notion of emptiness and impermanence helps a lot, because you have to mentally adjust from porthole roads to a fancy hotel to a cricket bed to a grueling session and in a beautiful place like NAINITAL. But I was told the sun will set at 4 p.m. and I don't have my jacket or sweater on, so Petru, you're better prepared. Yeah.
I'll be like Walter Riley and I'll hand over my cloak. How does your interaction with the Tibetan community work in different places?
We run our own schools, hospitals, settlements, monasteries, and finance. We have a Tibetan community bank, not exactly bank. So you go to any community, they ask for scholarship for children, for education, health, culture, language, religion, all kinds of issues. So even though I'm in exile, but I run a government like any other government. The difference is that without any resources, you have to run government exile, so very tough. We have to have a green book, which is called, it's quite oxymoron. It's a voluntary freedom tax. It's a tax, but you pay voluntarily for your freedom. So if you don't pay, you're not Tibetan. If you pay, you're Tibetan. But it's voluntary, huh? So you have to pay that. That contributes about 6.5% of the budget. But then there are Tibetans, who sponsor a child or two in school, or sponsor a college student, or monks in monasteries. So we are trying to develop a self-reliant, sustainable, economy.
Which is quite difficult. I think the great liberal political theorists like Locke or Mill believed there was always a price for freedom. So fair enough that you should be obliged to pay for your freedom, huh?
Definitely, yeah. And it's also an exciting and a bit of an adventure, because in life we always say you need a purpose. As a Tibetan, you are born with a purpose, to free your homeland. So we already have a well-defined purpose. So we don't have to, like millennials, you don't have to look for a purpose in life. We already have a purpose, and purpose is to regain our freedom.
So I remember when I first went to Dharamsala in the 1980s, there were still a lot of people around at that time who had worked in the late 50s, early 60s on things like the road building projects. There were people who were very much themselves in exile, the feeling of being in exile for that generation, who, you know, quite often in their 20s or 30s, they'd had to completely reorientate their entire life to be in India. And to an extent, that generation has passed on. How do you bridge the gaps between the Tibetans who came out in the 50s and 60s, the later generation of exiles, and then the people like yourself who were born in India or in Nepal, and so for whom Tibet is what I've described in the past as an imagined memory.
Yeah.
So it's almost as if you have this extraordinary allegiance to your homeland, but it's not your birthplace.
You're right. I think you use the word imagined memory, but for us it's imagined Tibet. Because I was born and brought up in Darjeeling, in a remote village. And so I'm also a gaonwala, you know, bastiwala, so I'm very proud of it. So it's imagined Tibet because you have never been to Tibet, but then you always think about and want to do something about Tibet. Now, as far as elder generation is concerned, those who were born and brought up in Tibet, who came to exile, many of the roads in Dalhousie and Manali and Sikkim were built by Tibetans, actually, when they came in 1950s and 60s. So for them, Tibet was real and raw. So their purpose, their determination was very clear. Now, for example, my father, you know, used to look at me as a lost generation, you know, because he was very tough, right? When they lost their country, obviously they had to flee for weeks and months. They say they never untied the chuba, you know, the dress, and they ate whatever they could get on the way, you know. And then they looked at me. He always used to say, "You are a soft generation. You don't know hard work, determination." So when I got elected, my biggest personal regret is that I wish he was there, you know. You could see what a hopeless son has taken over the leadership of the Tibetan freedom movement. I don't know whether he'll be happy or sad about it, you know. So, but for them, it was raw, you know. For us, it's imagined Tibet. But then I just feel, you know, my blood is as red, as Tibetan as my father's, you know, blood was. So even I was born as a Tibetan, I will die as a Tibetan, and till I die, I fight for the Tibetan cause. So that way, I think the new generation will not disappoint the elder generation.
I think that is true. I know that this coming year you're going to be commemorating the 60th anniversary of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the many Tibetan people, about 100,000 Tibetan people, coming into exile. And part of the idea behind that is the idea of thank you India, the idea that India has given refuge to a significant number of people. Can you explain that a bit more?
You know, we borrowed a lot from India. For example, we are non-violent. Our movement is, we borrowed Gandhi and Ahimsa. Our democracy, if you come to Dharamsala when Parliament is session, it's grueling but very polite and, you know, nice. And in our scriptures, a lot of things. In some sense, we have perfected the Indian Sanskriti, Indian culture and Indian custom. So we've been in exile for 60 years. And we feel we are standing on our own feet because of India, this great country, and the love and kindness of this, you know, this beautiful India. Hence, we have dedicated this year as Thank You India Year. So, and hence officially and formally, we organize event on March 31st in Dharamsala, where the Minister of Culture, Mahesh Sharma and Ram Madhav, they came to accept the Thank You India award to the government of India. So hence I've been traveling to various places in India to thank. As you said, I'll be in Simla on the 15th of this month, and I was in Karnataka a month ago. So, you know, we've been thanking. And today I'm here in Nainital. So from this stage, I want to thank the state of Uttarakhand for hosting Tibetans in Nainital and in the state of Uttarakhand.
And in Uttarakhand, you have got a comparatively large Tibetan community. I think it's the third largest of any state in India. Would there have been historic links between the two places? I mean, if you went back a few hundred years, would there have been Pahari Tibetan crossovers, maybe merchants would have gone back and forth, or pilgrims would have gone back and forth.
Yes, I think Murli Manohar Joshi ji also, and a lot of Tibetan traders used to come from Tibet to Uttarakhand, to Himachal, to Ladakh, to Kashmir. And in winter they go to Bodh Gaya and Varanasi for pilgrimages. These are the important Buddhist sites. And in the spring they go back. So Uttarakhand, because we all are connected through mountains, So the Kumaon festival attracted me partly because I am a mountain boy, was maybe I'm not boy anymore, but mountain man. But so the mountain connection is there. So you cross over, you reach Nepal, and then Tibet is right there. Yeah. The connection has always been there.
And people would have gone from here to Mansarovar?
Oh yes. Actually, this has been one of the main routes also before, no? Yeah. And then before, when Tibet was free, no visa was required. So anyone can cross over from anywhere, right? Do you want that, or do you want all these restrictions that you have to go to Sikkim and, there are only 2 routes or 3 routes, right? Yeah. So before we used to cross over, our herders, sheep herders used to cross over this side and, from Uttarakhand to that side. So it was, there was hardly any border post. Now I think Indian government spends about several $billion protecting the border. The Indian government could have spent on education and health of an Indian population.
If there was a more friendly neighbor.
If there was Tibet and there were Tibetan, president.
Well, times change.
No, we can still reverse the time, That's the whole purpose. Yeah.
And I mean, one of the sort of curious things about your position is the fact that when the Dalai Lama first came into exile, he was very keen to hand over some of the responsibility, the practical and political responsibility, to what would you say, a secular or civilian administration. This was a long and gradual process. And at each stage, I guess one of the difficulties has been that a world leader anywhere might want to engage directly in dialogue with him, and yet many of the political responsibilities have transferred today to you. How do you navigate that rather difficult situation?
And as I said, the Buddhist notion of impermanence and emptiness helps you. Literally, it helps you. And also, you have to understand that it's a Tibetan freedom struggle. The freedom is there in the middle. The struggle is very apt. Every day, every moment is a struggle. For example, I go to, I'll not name, a European country. I will be going to several. Often it happens that when I'm scheduled to meet with the Speaker of the Parliament, and half an hour prior to the meeting, I get a call saying the meeting is cancelled because the Chinese embassy got to know about it and pressured the foreign ministry, and the foreign ministry pressured the Speaker of the Parliament, even though she was or she is a friend of Tibet, Yeah. So often it happens, I'm, walking towards, it happened in Parliament of Switzerland. My meeting was scheduled at 10:30, and as we were walking towards the Parliament, we got a call saying, please come at 10:45 through gate number 2. So when we reached there, we found out the Chinese delegation was there from 9:30 to 10:30, persuading the Swiss parliamentarians not to meet with me. And again, but it happens that many people do meet with you. So, if you are glass is half empty, yeah, Genevieve, there's bottles are there. But if you are glass half empty type, you go to depression. So I'm always a glass half full type. So meetings are cancelled, doesn't matter. You go to the next meeting. But there are many good people around the world, like forum here. Different places I go to, I get forums and get to meet with senators, congressmen in the U.S., members of parliament. So I will be meeting, So that way I think doors, closes on one hand and opens another.
But when you have those meetings, do they assume that you speak on behalf of the Tibetan people in exile, or do they say, in a previous meeting, the Dalai Lama said this? How does that equation work?
Sometimes they have no clue. They actually think I was from Tibet. So is Tibet very cold, right? Somebody asks you. Some know I'm from exile, But often they're politically correct, so they don't get into that. Okay. So, we claim to represent or be the spokesperson for the Tibetan people, and then they would like to hear our version, Yeah. I must mention one point. Patrick, he said he endorsed me when I was running for election in 2011. Thank God no one saw that endorsement. I would have lost. Patrick, he is expert in many fields, also in Tibet. But his book was one of the bestseller, but also has gained some notoriety from some section of Tibetans. So Patrick's
I think you're going to have
endorsement,
to explain why it gained notoriety.
his interpretation and perspective of Tibet and Tibetan movement was not welcomed by some section of the Tibetan community. Let's put it that way. So I would have gotten more votes here than in the Tibetan community because of Patrick's endorsement. Now I'm not running for re-election. My term ends in 2021, it's two-term limit. So I can be Patrick and be photographed, videotape, no, doesn't matter.
I should mention that I was invited by you to Dharamsala only in December of last year.
That's true.
So I'm still permitted on Dharamsala soil to engage in, let's say, debate and discussion.
Yeah, I'm inclusive guy, Yeah, doesn't matter. I like all kinds of views, yeah. And I can proudly say Patrick endorsed me in 2011, but no one knew about it. Thank goodness, I won't.
But I mean, in terms of the argument that I made in Tibet, which is that the not so much the exiled Tibetan freedom movement, but more the Western backed, and particularly going back a little bit to, let's say, the days of Hollywood and Richard Gere, backing the Tibetan movement. And that was a movement that to an extent I was involved in the 1990s. My feeling was that it had reached a bit of a dead end, and that it really had no serious influence on the government in Beijing. I mean, how would you counter that argument?
Also, I'm, kind of by that argument. When I travel around the world, I also tell people in the West or friends, I always say, you all are Tibet support group, you all are supporters, So we will define what we want, and you put us from behind, Don't lead us, you see. I always say, we are the pilot and you be in the plane. I mean, you can sit business class, economy class, it's a secondary consideration to you, but let us drive or ride the plane, So hence you're right, when people...
And that does happen more now than it was happening 20 years ago, for sure.
Now, yeah, I'm that way a bit of a nationalist. I said, let us define, and then you support us. That's how we move forward. So I agree with you, Patrick, yeah.
The key question that I think a lot of people in policy institutes, think tanks talk about is it likely that the Beijing government will seek at some point in the future to declare their own 15th Dalai Lama? And if they do, what happens? What do you do?
Oh, that's their plan, I think. They have a game plan. But we think it will not work, primarily because spirituality is a matter of heart and mind, You can't buy or you can't force. For example, Mr. Yechuri, selects one Shankaracharya and says, hey, he's Shankaracharya and all the Hindu devotees should follow. The Shankaracharya is very unlikely, and Yechuri is a nice guy, But now if a Communist Party of China endorses the Dalai Lama and asks Tibetans to follow the Dalai Lama, it's very unlikely, So Raul Castro, appoints the Pope and expects all the Catholics to follow. Very unlikely, right? And if you look at the track record of Chinese government, I mean, what they have done in Tibet, they destroyed 98% of monasteries and nunneries, destroyed 99.9% of monks and nuns, right? Even now, the photograph of Dalai Lama is banned. And that is in the memory or in the minds of Tibetan people. And once they come out with next Dalai Lama and say, follow him, very unlikely. So next Dalai Lama will be, selected in exile, primarily because the idea of reincarnation is you're coming back to fulfill the mission and the vision of the previous Dalai Lama. So he or she has to continue from where he or she left, and if he's to pass away in exile, he has to be born in exile.
I think one of the difficulties for people inside Tibet is access to information. And so I noticed, for example, that the Chinese declared Panchen Rinpoche was quite often assumed by people inside Tibet to be the real deal because they didn't really know enough to realize that this was a stooge, an imposed person that the Beijing government had put in. How do you deal with that problem?
Now I think it's pretty clear. This is Chinese selected Panchen Lama, and the real Panchen Lama has disappeared for more than 20 years now.
He's been under house arrest for 20 years.
House arrest for 20 years. In fact, he has disappeared, right? So I think the one
Story is that there were a lot of posters being sold in Lhasa, on the roadside of Lhasa. There was posters of all kinds of leaders and also the Chinese Panchen Lama. And then actually there was no
poster of Chinese Panchen Lama, right? So this guy goes and says, you have all kinds of posters. Why don't you have a poster of Chinese Panchen Lama too? And the Chinese woman who was selling posters, she said, I mean, do I look that stupid? Why should I sell something that doesn't sell, you know? So Tibetans are not buying the poster, meaning, you know, they don't regard him as the real Panchen Lama. So it's true, initially there was this issue, but then words travel fast, yeah?
So do you feel that what might be called Tibetan soft power, anything from religion to Tibetan medicine to the Dalai Lama's idea of secular ethics, do you feel that has a very strong global influence in not so much determining political support, but just giving a general sense of backing to the Tibetan cause?
You know, it's a struggle, right? So first you must survive. Then you should strengthen and sustain and succeed, right? So first, the survival is key. And if you can survive through Buddhism or spirituality that we have, you know, it's
it's a survival. And then use and
strengthened. For example, we have a lot of prayer flags, right? It symbolizes Tibet and it symbolizes a lot of things, you know. So similarly, I think Buddhism is spread all over the world, and because of which we have a lot of, you know, supporters. Now, oddly, China has also become the largest Buddhist country in the world. 300 to 400 million Chinese are Buddhists now. So that way, on one front, we have won. Because after 98% of destruction of Buddhist monasteries in Tibet, we came into exile, primarily India. We rebuilt all the major monasteries, revived Buddhism, then spread it all over the world, and all the Himalayan belt, back in Tibet also, Buddhism is back. Now Buddhism is back in China also. I'm sure Mao Zedong is rolling in his grave thinking, I destroyed Buddhism in Tibet, now Buddhism is in China, right? So that way from cultural front, we have won.
Talking about Sikyong and Zhou Enlai and that generation, even Jawaharlal Nehru himself, do you find that the fact the Dalai Lama met and knew those people who now seem like, you know, it's almost like a completely different era, you know, to think that he in his teens and in his 20s had those long dialogues and conversations with Mao. Is that a resource, a historical resource that you're able to draw on, those kind of consultations and those discussions in working out how to approach the present leadership in Beijing?
I don't think they have transcript per se. It's mainly based on memory of His Holiness Dalai Lama.
Does he speak to you about that?
Yes, I've often he has spoken in public, no? Yeah, initially, you know, he looked at Mao Zedong like a father figure. I mean, he was very senior. He was, you know, giving him leadership training, skills, guidance, things like that. But I think it was the final meeting where Mao Zedong looked at His Holiness and said, you look like a very smart leader. You will be a great leader of Tibet. But he said, he whispered in his ear, religion is poison. That kind of shocked His Holiness Dalai Lama, and that changed his view.
And he never trusted him after
that. Then never trusted him after that, yes. Now, at present, you can see Xi Jinping, you know, I mean, he wants to be something like Mao Zedong, no?
Right.
so there are some similarities that way. Yeah.
Are there let's say indirect or informal overtures that you get from people around the leadership, not the leadership itself, but around the leadership, which gives you some cause for optimism going forward?
Dharamsala is an interesting place, right? I think His Holiness Dalai Lama is giving a Buddhist teaching as we speak. I think today is the final day. Hundreds and thousands of Chinese from China come to Dharamsala to seek teachings from His Holiness Dalai Lama. So I have met, you know, young Chinese who are Buddhist, who will be flying not directly to China, but fly to Hong Kong or Singapore. Then they go back to your hometown. So, you know, many Buddhists come there. And then there are a lot of journalists claiming to be journalists or academics who will ask a lot of questions, but we are, open, we are transparent. They can ask any number of questions, and they do say that they send the report back to Beijing. And that way, I think, informally, there's a lot of conversation, but there's no formal dialogue per se. But we had formal dialogue in late 80s, early 80s, and then 80s, but mainly from 2002 to 2010. We had 9 rounds where the envoys with the Dalai Lama met with the representative of the Chinese government. So we had formal dialogue, but there was no breakthrough, and it still remains the case. So this being the final question, and let me end with Russia. So people say China is so powerful and increasingly so. What are your chances? And we say chances are great, because from a spiritual point of view, as I said, we already won. They destroyed Buddhism in Tibet. We have revived in Tibet, whole of Himalayan belt, back in China as well. Now on political front also, Russia is Russia now because there's no more Soviet Union. At one time, everybody said Soviet Union will take over America and take over the world. Soviet Union is no more there. The Berlin Wall came down. No one believed, because the best story is that I remember meeting the former president of Poland, Lech Walesa, and he said the then chancellor and the foreign minister of West Germany was with him. And then the foreign minister asked him, what do you think of all the students and youth surrounding the Berlin Wall? And Lech Walesa told the foreign minister, the Berlin Wall is coming down. You better be prepared. Then foreign minister of West Germany said, I wish that problem will happen in my lifetime, but it's not going to happen. And within few months, Berlin Wall came down. So you have heard the stories from time and again. I went to South Africa. If you read the newspaper account of Nelson Mandela, just few months prior to his release from prison, a lot of obituaries were written about him, right? Forget about restoring democracy in South Africa. He won't be released from, Robben Island, And then we have heard about Northern Ireland, right? I remember taking classes, attending, and says, Northern Ireland, it cannot be solved because people with same God are killing each other, right? And in the name of Jesus Christ, how can you ever solve this, It looked intractable. But they signed Good Friday Agreement. Same thing with Aung San Suu Kyi. Of course, she's getting some negative reviews now. But same thing. She was under house arrest and she was fighting against military junta. She said, how can one woman take over military? And she did. So there are a lot of non-violent, successful stories around the world. If they could do it, we can too. And we have Buddhism on our side. And communism is 100 years old and quickly disappearing. And Buddhism is 2,600 years and still running and flying with like this prayer flags. So I think we will prevail in the end. And we'll take over the infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sikyong.
Thank you. I got a scarf and I must return the favor. Thank you. And to the organizer, this is an official emblem. So it says, in profound appreciation of your support to Tibetan people and Tibet. Yeah?
Okay.
So with my signature and all that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is precious. It's going up in the house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Come. Please
Thank you.
come. Have tea.
Yes.
So I'm very happy to be back in Nainital at the Himalayan Mountain Echoes Festival, because I've been having the opportunity to be in conversation with Sikyong Dr. Lobsang Sangay, and we were able to talk about various issues. Some were cultural, some were political, some were historical. We talked about the connections between the people of Uttarakhand and the people of Tibet, going back over different periods in history. We talked about the efforts that the Central Tibetan Administration make in order to uphold the dignity of the Tibetan people, both inside Tibet and outside Tibet. And finally, he mentioned in particular the idea of thank you, India. The idea that it is now 60 years since the Dalai Lama and around 100,000 Tibetan refugees came into exile in India. And he made the point that India had provided a home for a very significant number of people, and it had created a bond between Tibetans and Indians.
I was so impressed. I was impressed because he spoke for all of Tibet, all Tibetans, and it touched my heart a great deal. I have met His Holiness the Dalai Lama a number of times, and I'm honoured to be here, and I feel it's a great privilege. And I must say that, pardon me, I'm being a bit running, that I feel he is a politician for world peace. Just as His Holiness the Dalai Lama and my Pope Francis are spiritual leaders for peace, so Dr. Lobsang Sangay is a peace politician, world peace politician. He's wonderful. I don't really know what to say because I've only just met him and I haven't read his books, but I was just so deeply impressed from the heart.
With President Sangay was very, very enlightening, and everybody, I think, got lots of correct view of Tibet from his side. But then, after among many questions, one of the questions was that I've been to Tibet 3 times, 4 times, and traveled by different routes to many different areas. And naturally, we don't speak the language or we don't interact with people so much. But then what we saw looked very rich. I mean, Lhasa was like almost mini Hong Kong. All monasteries were well functioning, well oiled, superb. Though of course Lama cannot talk. And even Shigatse, Gyantse, and then right till western Tibet, Shinkwin, all there were absolutely 4-lane highways. So infrastructure development was excellent. And then how do you say that monasteries are destroyed or Tibet is subjugated? That was my question. But then Prime Minister, President Sangay gave a very correct answer. You see, the Chinese have built the roads not for benefit of Tibetan people. They've done it for their own benefit. They want everything, minings and everything go, and all the products taken out of Tibet to China and to make money.
It's our honor to have Dr. Lobsang Sangay here with us today. He is participating in the curtain raiser session for Himalayan Echoes, which begins officially tomorrow.